All right, everybody, new chapter, new day. We're going to start talking today about the Second World War more specifically. Uh, Here we are, chapter 26, okay, which focuses really on World War II. We left off chapter 25 right as Pearl Harbor happened. We're picking this chapter up the day after, pretty much, or right after Pearl Harbor happened. So America goes from one day really not wanting to be in the war. We talked about quite a bit. Roosevelt's trying to find a way to convince people that war is necessary, and these Nazis are really bad, and the Japanese are they're mean, and and we should get involved. It's the right thing to do. We need to help our pal Great Britain, France, but who cares about them? But primarily, we want to help our pal Great Britain. And they're in trouble. Okay, the war is really going bad for the Allies at this point. France has fallen. The U.S. has just been attacked at Pearl Harbor. Japan is expanding throughout the South Pacific with nobody really stopping them. Uh, Great Britain's on the verge of collapse, and then the United States is now just getting involved. So if you had to make odds at this point about this war and who's going to win, you got to be thinking the Axis. You got to be thinking Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo and Japan, and all these folks are going to be the ones to win. But anyway, so what we're going to talk about here is a little bit about kind of what's going on at home during the war. We'll talk a little bit about on my next video. We'll talk about kind of what happened, um, in the fighting just a little bit. But today I want to focus kind of on what we're doing at home during the war. So let's go on for it. All right. So race and gender in wartime America. What does that mean? Well, okay. Let's first start talking about African Americans and their influence and their role in the war here. So, African Americans in the war. Well, for one of the main names, and this is a guy that you should remember from the New Deal, but you probably don't, is a guy named A. Philip Randolph. Okay, he's the guy that ran that union for the guys that worked the elevators, or sleeping car porters as they were called. Uh, Randolph is going to be a major figure here for African Americans during the war effort. Okay, now pay close attention. He formed something called the FEPC. Okay, the FEPC is another acronym for you. That's the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Okay, and obviously their job was to ensure that employment practices were fair, particularly for minorities and African Americans. Randolph reached out to Franklin Roosevelt and said, "Hey, what are we going to do for African Americans, and how can they contribute to the war effort? We're not doing enough." He's helps instrumental in getting this FEPC started, and gets a lot of things going for African Americans here. African Americans get jobs uh, and less discrimination in the workplace. The FEPC, Fair Employment Practices Commission, again, write that down. Fair Employment Practices Commission is going to go a long way in creating workplace opportunity for African Americans. And in the long run, the big result of this is this, and their contributions during the war, it leads to the ultimate desegregation of the military. Again, it leads to the ultimate desegregation of the military. A third time, it results in the desegregation of the military in 1947. 1947, we have the military is no longer white only and separate black units. You've probably heard of the Tuskegee Airmen or other all black units in World War II. Because of the FEPC and the efforts of people like A. Philip Randolph, that's the end of that. Another big contribution from Randolph here in the long term, we have uh, Randolph threatened if Roosevelt wasn't going to do anything to better the opportunities for African Americans, he promised a march on Washington D.C. and said there would be 100,000 demonstrators there that would um, bring up the cause of African American rights. Roosevelt doesn't want that to happen, so of course he, helps in the formation and the creation of the FEPC, right, Fair Employment Practices Commission again. But this is a big deal because it sets the stage for the much more well-known March on Washington in 1963 with Martin Luther King Jr., in which A. Philip Randolph was a major player in setting up and making happen. So we see, the long-term effects here, the stage being set for the civil rights movement. That's an important thing to think about too. You want to write something down on an AP exam if you're asked a question on an essay or whatever about African Americans and the civil rights movement. You say something about A. Philip Randolph and the roots of the civil rights movement going back to the World War II era and how important that was. You've hit a home run. All right. Now, obviously, because we always have problems with race and issues of that nature, there's going to be some race riots, wartime race riots in several cities during this time period, because when tensions are high, people tend to get more racial, and race riots, particularly in Detroit. The book mentions the riots in Detroit most notably, and in a couple other places. But same thing happens as every other story. People get upset. African Americans are angry about their lack of opportunities. Whites are angry because African Americans want opportunities. There's a little violence. People die. Unfortunately, as is usually the case, the majority of people that die are African American. All right. So let's move on to another really sad thing in our country's history, the internment of Japanese Americans. So this is one of the big AP things they love talking about. We can call it super important AP point, number 20, I don't know, 19, 18, no, it's like 19 or 20. Anyway, it's a super important point because it often appears on AP exams in one form or another. The internment of Japanese Americans. If I had to rank the worst things this country has done, number one, slavery. Number two, killing all the Native Americans pretty much. Number three, probably throwing Japanese Americans in relocation centers. Mostly around the west, pretty much west of the Rocky Mountains, are where almost all these relocation centers were. Japanese Americans were thought to be, spies or dangerous to the United States because the Japanese had bombed us at Pearl Harbor. So we get relocation centers. They get sent to these centers where they're not really forced to do anything. Some of them do like farm work or anything like that. It's not like a concentration camp, but they just have to go there and be there and stay there. Okay, and that is really kind of a really black mark. Now, you'd think at the time, you'd say, well, people are upset with Japan at the time, and I understand and all this stuff. Yeah, but a lot of people didn't like the internment camps in the 40s when we had them. Okay, and that's with a lot of people that are really angry with Japan. So this was probably really a bad idea and a bad decision by our government, Roosevelt included, to go and say, let's take all the Japanese and stick them in these camps until we figure out what's next. Not a good look, not a good scene, and the rest is history. The most famous court case regarding this was Korematsu versus U.S. from 1942. I think it was 42 or 44. Remember, it upheld the right for the relocation centers to exist. Now, for there even to be a case in the Supreme Court regarding the constitutionality of interning Japanese Americans, there had to be some dissent and some public outcry that these things were wrong. Okay, so don't think that since we don't like Japan in the 40s, everybody's behind the idea of throwing them all in camps. Okay, so Native Americans. So we just talked about the screwing of Japanese Americans. What do we do for Native Americans in the war? Things actually get a little bit better for them here, at least kind of. There's more opportunity for Native Americans, with many of the able-bodied young white men leaving for the war it opens up job opportunities. So you start to see willingly Native Americans leave the reservations to go to the cities to find work in factories and things of that nature, to take these jobs during the war. Now, that's good that, they're kind of, you think, assimilating to our culture a little bit through doing that, which we gotta like. But of course, they're Native Americans, so they get screwed in one way or another. And in this particular case, they just had to deal with a lot of hostility and limited opportunities when going to the city looking for work. They got longer hair, they looked different. It wasn't, too socially acceptable, I guess, in some regards. They're not very well educated, so their opportunities are limited. But we see a lot of Native Americans leaving the reservations, going to the cities, and seeking out opportunities there. Now, aside from that, probably the most heralded thing that Native Americans did during the war were their contributions as the Navajo Code Talkers. These Navajo Code Talkers are really, really important. Some of them are still alive today. They created code in their Navajo language that the Axis, mostly Japan, but Germany and Italy were unable to break because nobody knew the code language other than the Navajo. We were able to successfully get codes and information out without it being stolen by our enemies during the war. These Navajo Code Talkers were great heroes for the war effort for doing that, and it shows a long way that our country has come from using our military against Native Americans to now welcoming them into the U.S. military. So at least in that regard. So that's a little bit on race and gender in wartime America. Let's continue on. Okay, so I just totally messed up a bunch of things. And so I don't even know how this is going to seem, but whatever. So let's just continue on, and hopefully you got everything. And I know that made no sense, but I'm super confused now because I suck at technology. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about women and children's roles in wartime as well. So first off, you've got Rosie the Riveter, who's obviously probably the most iconic image, one of the most iconic images from World War II. Understand a couple things about Rosie the Riveter. A lot of people misinterpret Rosie the Riveter as this image of the woman, being involved in the war effort in terms of joining the military and things like that. Rosie the Riveter is more of an encouraging figure to encourage women to take over the industrial jobs being left by men at the end of, or while they're off fighting in World War II. So Rosie encourages people to get involved in the war, and women to get involved in the war effort by, getting these industrial jobs, ramping up industrial production, and tell them, hey, you can do these same jobs that men do. Women are just as capable. So that's a big deal, right? So it's not Rosie as somebody that's in the military. It's Rosie the Riveter, somebody who is a big part of ramping up production for the war, right? Women in the military are something that happened as well, though, through the form of what we call WACs and WAVES, okay? WACs is the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which was the Army version that allowed women in the military. And the WAVES were the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. That is the Navy version of women in the military. WACs the WACs were kind of, and now it's just later got shortened to just the WACs. But the WACs were women that could serve in the military, not in combat roles, serving basically in the Army in three basic functions: switchboard operators, mechanics, bakers, right? Because they bake food and it's non-perishable and stuff. So you got them, but that was about the limit of what women involvement could be. The WAVES could actually do a little bit more. There's some more expectations. WAVES served in the Navy as lawyers and doctors and other roles, and they could actually become non-commissioned officers, which was something that couldn't happen in the WAC or in the WACs. So a little bit more responsibility and opportunity for women in the Navy version, but still a big jump and a big move and opportunity growing for women here. We've seen African Americans with more opportunity in the military, Native Americans, and now women. Not full equality. That wouldn't happen until 1978, when we ended the gender discrimination in the military. So that was still a ways away, but this is a good start. This is a step in the right direction. So what else do we do? Well, we have to temporarily lift child labor restrictions during the war, because look, a lot of women have jobs. Their husbands are off fighting in the war, and they need to some way to figure out how to take care of their kids. So a lot of these women would actually have their children working with them during the war years, just to keep an eye on them. There was a big problem during the war of kids just being left at home. They called latchkey kids, where the parents would basically, or their mother would basically lock them in the house when she had to go to work because dad is off fighting in the war. And so, of course, that's a big problem. Lifting some child labor restrictions is kind of a way to deal with it. What else? Okay, I'm not quite sure why that's here, but obviously after the war, when men come home, we have the beginning of the baby boom. Why? Because, well, women hadn't seen their husbands in quite some time. Unmarried women hadn't seen men in quite some time, so they're happy to see each other, and 9 months later, you got kids, more kids, or whatever. Just use your imagination on that one. So, what about Mexican Americans? We haven't talked much this year about Mexican Americans, and there's good reason for that, because there haven't been many Mexican Americans. Well, this all changes through the creation of something called the Braceros Program. The Braceros Program was a work program that invited Mexican American laborers, typically farm laborers, agricultural laborers, to come up to America and tend farms and work a lot of agriculture type jobs and some other jobs while all the other men are off fighting in the war. Okay, so the Braceros Program brings a lot of Mexican Americans here. It's supposed to be temporarily, but many of them, of course, end up staying, and that's what we get out of there. So the argument, has it ever ended? We could very easily say no, it hasn't. And of course, when you bring in a new immigrant group into this country, we all know by this time what happens when we do that. Racial problems. This in particular is something called the Zoot Suit riots. Okay, now a Zoot Suit is what is pictured up here. It's basically a suit with a really long coat and baggy pants that was really popular amongst young Mexican American teens and guys in their early 20s during the war years, because what teenager doesn't want to wear a big baggy suit, especially in Los Angeles? Well, a lot of Navy guys kind of took offense to this, and it led to some big riots in Los Angeles. So basically, these Mexican American guys were there. They just want to have fun, but people take offense to what they're wearing. Riots occur. Violence happens. Where it's a racial issue is as soon as these Mexican guys strike back, they get arrested by police, and ultimately they ban the wearing of Zoot suits in Los Angeles and ultimately some other cities around the country. Their style was a little bit different, with the bigger suits. White people didn't like that. They also kind of slicked back their hair and put in these little tails, not like ponytails, but even smaller than that, called ducktails. So the sailors would kind of cut those ducktails off and rip their clothes up, and just led to some uncomfortable problems. So anyway, folks, I went a little bit longer than I wanted to there, but I always do because I don't want to shut up. Anyway, so that is the end of the first part here, chapter 26. I will get the next part out to you tomorrow, and we'll plan on a quiz Friday. See ya.